we still sort of ascribe to these general stereotypes. And one of the points that Millett is going to make in this section is that she's going to talk about how this notion of physical strength is totally irrelevant to the political power relationships that we find ourselves in. Now, this is probably different than most of us have understood patriarchy in the past, right? We might think that, well, men have found themselves at the top of this power structure because they have these, supposedly stronger physical or sexual characteristics, right? And here she's saying that male supremacy actually doesn't even depend on their physical strength, but is actually going to depend more upon our psychological value systems, right? So the ideas that we are grown up with, not as much as the actual biological fact of the matter, right? And so she'll give us some examples of this down the line. So gender here is going to have a psychological or cultural, right, rather than biological connotation, right? It's perhaps why someone could have a very perhaps strong physique as a man, but if they were to act in a way that might be considered traditionally feminine, we would then make presumptions about their identity that had more to do with their feminine aspects than their physical strength, right? And so the same could be said of women, right? If you were looking at a woman, someone who is born into a female body that is perhaps embodying traditional notions of petite size or a demure way of carrying themselves, but if that individual is perhaps very outspoken, right, very intelligent and forceful in vocalizing their own opinions, right? I can think of AOC as someone who might fit this sort of characteristic. Then they are immediately, right, denied the sort of praise that traditional femininity has received in a patriarchal structure, right? They begin to be criticized, right, cut down, more so again because of those psychological, right, or characteristic temperament aspects more so than just their physique, right? So we can think of examples on both sides of this. Millett that concludes this section by noting that because of our social circumstances, right, because men and women, males and females, have been socialized in these different ways, we actually have two entirely different cultures, right, and that their life experiences are thus completely different. Now, of course, this is an earlier form of feminism, right? So it's not going to be as inclusive, but we can add on to this idea that perhaps, again, not all men, right, have the same culture, right? So if we're looking at it from a position of race, similarly, right, not all women are going to be having the same experiences. Again, going outside the binary, we can look at how intersex, trans, right, other members of the LGBT community might also have different quote-unquote cultural experiences, right, because of their unique experiences in the world, right? But the idea is that this comes from very early conditioning, right? It starts not just from our parents and peers, but it can begin, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, even from the perspective of the doctors who are assigning biological sex. All right, so the third category or dimension of sexism here is the sociological element, right? Where patriarchy's chief institution, as she says, is the family. And so we can see this as tied to different notions of feminism, again, in my earlier PowerPoint between radical Marxist and liberal feminism, right? So the idea here is that the primary mechanism of enforcing the patriarchy is first and foremost the family, right? And then the idea is that that then bleeds out into society and then larger to the state, right? And the idea here is that the fate of one of these things, right, society or state or family, will depend heavily on the functioning of the other two, right? So the idea is that people make arguments that we need to maintain a traditional notion of family because if we don't, that will somehow cause not just a disintegration within that family unit, but then as a result, disintegration in society and the state, and vice versa, right? Societies and states are seen as helping to protect those family units, and so if those societies or states were to fall apart or to become chaotic, so too then with the family, right? So these are all seen as very interconnected, and it's why we see such a heavy reflection of what we have known as the nuclear family, right? One man, one woman, married to each other, heteronormative, at least one child, right? So that sort of nuclear family is not only something that doesn't exist in most cases, right? Even if you happen to have heterosexual parents, right? We know that in many cases those parents are not, for a number of different reasons, capable of maintaining the same household, right? Maintaining that marriage, even maintaining that relationship with their child for whatever reason, right? So you could have been raised by someone else, right? Another family member, perhaps you were adopted, right? There are all these different scenarios that we can imagine. But we still see this sort of presumption in society and state that that is what a family is and what a family should look like. Right? And so these states, whether they're religious or secular, right, non-religious, tend to presume not only that those families are the norm, but thus then that the father is the head of that household, right? And so this idea is then supported by societies and states specifically, not just with legal parameters, but also with financial incentives, right? So this goes back to the origins of the gender gap, right? Why men have historically made more money than women.